Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. Hello, Ben. How are you?
G'day, mate. How you going?
Pretty good. How's the beard, mate? Have we got a countdown to when it's coming off, or is it just indefinite?
No. When we move out of stage 4, that's the plan. Just a little bit of a milestone remembrance to get rid of this hairy growth on my face, but it's not really great for podcast listeners, is it?
Well, let's all hope that we all get a Father's Day present this Sunday, Ben, and we get a plan.
That's good.
On how we're going to come out of stage 4, so that'll be nice. Hey, Ben, just a little reminder that next week we are going to launch the audiobook version of our best-selling book, which has sold over 22,000 copies, Ben.
How exciting. Thank God you're reading it, not me.
The Armchair Guide to Property Investing, Ben. Now, for those folks who haven't been playing along at home for most of this year, I had to record it twice, Ben. And at the first time was a practice, clearly.
Due to technical difficulties, we have to reschedule this programming.
Recorded it twice. So all the professional people who in our community who are in the audio space, they're probably having a little chuckle right now, Ben. For the rest of you who are not quite aware, it just means that I read for 4 days instead of 2. But I'm excited to. So stick around next week, Ben. We'll let you know how you can get hands on that. But hey, we gave a little hint, Ben, on who today's guest is.
Yes, super excited.
Podcast. So we have got some epic content to share. But before we get to our very special guest today, Ben, I'm going to continue my tour through one of the most influential, best books of all time, in my humble opinion, Ben. Is How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? So I'm enjoying this. I've got some feedback around it, Ben, so I'm going to keep doing it, right? But today I'm going through part 2, which is 6 ways to make people like you, Ben. So chapter 6 is, if you don't do this, you are headed for trouble, Ben.
Ooh, righty-o.
Nice little hook there. So basically the chapter is filled with lots of anecdotes, Ben, which are really, really great anecdotes. I've got 2 to share in a second. But here's the crux of it. The average person is interested in his or her own name. They're more interested in his or her own name than in all the other names on earth put together. Ben, might give you a little hint about what the chapter is about. Remember that name and call it easily, and you have paid a subtle and very effective compliment. Don't forget it or misspell it though, Ben. And you have otherwise you will have placed yourself at a very sharp disadvantage. So here's an example. When a boy in Scotland got hold of a rabbit, it was a mother rabbit, Ben. So presto, he soon had a whole nest of little rabbits and nothing to feed them. So he had a brilliant idea. He told the boys and girls in the neighbourhood that if they would go out and pull enough clover and dandelions to feed the rabbits, he would name the bunnies in their honour. Plan worked like magic, Ben, and Carnegie would never forget it, because later he made millions by using the same psychology in business. So, for example, he wanted to sell steel rails to the Pennsylvania Railroad, Ben. So J. Edgar Thompson was the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. I can't say railroad. Railroad.
And you're doing an audiobook.
Yeah, cool. So, yeah, that's a bit of a worry, isn't it? So Carnegie built a huge steel mill in Pittsburgh. And what did he call it, Ben? He called it the Edgar Thompson Steelworks, name of the president of the Pennsylvania Railway. So here's the riddle. So see if you can guess it. When the Pennsylvania Railroad needed steel rails, Ben, where do you suppose J. Edgar Thompson bought them? From Sears? No. From Roebuck? No. No, you're wrong. Guess again.
From GE? No.
Bought it from the place that had his name on the steelworks. So We should be aware of the magic contained in a name, Ben, and realise that this single item is wholly and completely owned by the person with whom we are dealing and nobody else.
I've just officially renamed our building, Bryce, to the federal government. They've got a bit of coin, haven't they? It's all ours, but they've got it. They get to
see if they'll channel it to us. So here's the thing. What's your name again? Ivis, what's the name of the bloke that I do this podcast with again? Oh, Ben. Sorry, Ben. So Ben, here's the point, right? So principle number 6. Remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language.
Got it. It's locked. Okay, Bruce, let's move on. I mean, Bryce, let's move on.
I like it. 1-1, I says 1-1. Okay, Ben, time to kick into today's guest. Very special guest. We've got to build this up a little bit. We're looking forward to it. You reached out, Ben. I've got to say you did a terrific job of getting this particular person onto our podcast because there's some wisdom, wasn't there?
Yeah, Bryce, I mean, like everybody else, I have mentors. Both people that I can spend a lot of time with and get some ideas from and some encouragement and learn from. And I also, have other mentors who I don't spend a lot of time with, but I can get to observe from afar. Well, Scott, without giving out his full details, has been one of those people. I have enjoyed reading his content. I've been to several of his keynote presentations. I've had chances to have conversations with him over the journey. And he has wisdom beyond his years, but his years are also incredible in terms of 50 years in the industry. So it was a delight for him to agree to come on to the podcast, and the listeners will not be disappointed with the gold that he delivers.
Yes, Ben, it's always good to revisit the original people who set the spark alight. So this interview is well and truly worth it. We're going to cut to it. Of course, we've built up a little curiosity, Ben. Of course, our guest is Scott Keck, is his name. He is the chairman of the largest valuation, or one of the largest valuation firms in Melbourne. Over 50 years of experience, Ben. Let's cut to this brilliant interview we had with Scott Keck. All right, Ben, very excited today. We've got a very special guest. Today we have with us Scott Keck, who's the chairman of Charter Keck Cramer, Ben. They're a leading independent Australian strategic property consulting firm. Scott has, Ben, 50 plus years property valuation experience within the Melbourne market, having begun with the firm in 1968, becoming director in 1978, and managing director in 1984, and then to become the chairman in 2010. Scott is frequently engaged as a senior negotiator in complex commercial and statutory issues related to the property market, and for advice in relation to large portfolio valuations for major statutory and private corporations. He regularly appears as an expert witness in litigation proceedings. A highly regarded and regular contributor to the national media and business magazines, in the last 8 years, listen to this, Ben, he's published over 500 articles on topics related to the property market. First of all, welcome to the Property Couch, Scott.
Thanks very much, Ron. Thank you.
Hey, Ben and I are really excited for a number of reasons. Your name is one of the premier names particularly in Melbourne, but across the country in terms of what you do. But for someone who's been across the property market for as long as you have, we're excited to dive in and hear some of the stories. But before we get there, I gave a bit of a bio that you started back in 1968. But what was the entree to property for you? How did you get excited by property, and how did you end up cutting the path that you did from right back from the beginning?
Well, look, sometimes it's just a good fortune. What happened was in 1967, I was at a boarding school in Melbourne. My parents were overseas. I did some work experience with a family friend who was an estate agent and valuer. He said to me, depending on what you do when you finish school next year, if you'd like to come and work here, you can do that. And I was aspiring to be a lawyer and study law, but I went and worked in the real estate environment and quite liked it, and quickly enrolled in the course as it was then to become a valuer at RMIT in Melbourne in 1969. It was a shorter course then, only a couple of years, and here I am now. So that was it. It was all just happenstance. Yeah.
And Scott, as part of that early story, were you predominantly resi with the real estate agent contact that you had, or was it a combination of residential and commercial or industrial?
Yes, well, look, for the first couple of years, the valuation practice that I was involved with was part of a real estate agency. But the gentleman, John Thompson, who owned that estate agency that had 4 branches, he wanted to retire, so he sold his estate agency. And I wasn't interested in an estate agency, and he asked me if I'd stay on and work with him in the valuation environment. So he kindly gave me 30% of his business, and so it was just a 2-man residential valuation practice based in the suburbs. That was about 1971 that we were actually at that point of definition. And then during the 70s, he worked less, I worked harder. That was the arrangement. And by the 80s, we were tapping on the door of a growing practice. We had a couple of younger guys working for us. We were starting to do a little bit of commercial work. And then really the opportunities came thick and fast, and it's been pretty much like that ever since. Yeah.
And where were the suburbs that you were doing those valuations in, Scott? Were you in East? Were you?
Yes, it started in Box Hill, which is a Middle Eastern suburb of Melbourne, now very well known for its Asian influence. It's a very funny story, actually. I'll only take a second to tell you.
No, do tell.
There was another real estate valuer at the time that was more advanced than we were and had a significant commercial practice, but there was a similarity of the names. And one day this instruction turned up at our office to value this significant property in the city. And I realised that it had been sent to our firm by mistake. But rather than sending it back, I hopped in and did it. And by the time and got it all done. And the matter got too far down the track, and the timelines became so quick that there wasn't any time for the instructions to be reissued. And so it was entirely accidental. Opportunity knocked. And I've got to say, I made sure I did that well. And that opened a few doors. So again, happenstance. Yeah.
Opportunity knocks. You got to take it.
Yeah. What a great story. Hey, Scott, you've seen a lot in the Melbourne landscape over the 60s and to the end of the 60s to where we are now. What are your observations from 50 years in the industry, particularly with Melbourne, but as broad as you'd like to make it across the country?
Sure. Well, look, one of the things I've learned over time is that every decade or so, you look across the landscape and you see that it has actually changed. I mean, the physical landscape. You don't see the real estate landscape changing by the minute, hour, day or year, but you do see it changing by the decade. And I think it's only after you've had a bit of experience that you really accept that things do change over a period of time. And when you've seen how areas do change, you have a greater depth of imagination to visualise how things may change in the future. Being an observer of slow-moving history in the real estate sector, you can imagine what the future may look like if you understand where the demand from population growth and the rate of population growth will be. How is housing and all of that type of thing going to respond to that? And you can imagine that certain areas will, take off. And I can distinctly remember probably 20 years ago when I moved my office into Richmond, looking down Church Street and Chapel Street in Richmond and saying to myself, it's not going to be long before tall towers start to emerge here and this whole landscape changes. And it is very much now as I imagined it would have been 20 years ago. And I don't think that it was because I had a crystal ball then. It's just that by that stage I'd already had 30 years experience of witnessing how things change. The more experience you've got, the more you can anticipate what the future holds. Yeah.
Now, Scott, I've been privileged to sit through a couple of your keynote presentations. I think I probably ratcheted up about 6 or 7 of them now, and I absolutely love them. And I through your knowledge, you've been able to instill in me the cycle of life in property, and you talk about refill greenfield and brownfield areas in terms of how they cultivate from, so examples would be, say, GTV9 in Richmond there, in terms of when Channel 9 sold that site, and then obviously it was then subdivided and rezoned into commercial and those type of things. With the 50 plus years of knowledge that you have, you must drive around Melbourne and just have this ability to sort of see where the future is going in terms of that next site or the next opportunity. I mean, Yarraville's a good example of that, and in terms of what's the back of Yarraville there, with all of the container yards and all of those types of things potentially being relocated. How do you cope with all of this wisdom that you have and this knowledge that you have in terms of the opportunity that you see in the market?
Well, it's a bit hard to remain humble giving an answer with that sort of introduction. But look, let me give you an example of something that I spoke about not so long ago. And just putting COVID-19 to the side for 1 minute, I know that we'll talk about that shortly. Given what has now been for about 10 years the historical rate of population growth in Melbourne, and although it's been momentarily interrupted, it'll come back again, and we'll talk about that. So given the rate of population growth that we're experiencing in Melbourne, and the changing preference and acceptance of other forms of housing, for example, townhouses and apartments more so because of affordability and all of this sort of thing, I can see when I look out the window of my office, which is to the side there, it all looks relatively flat at the moment. But over the next 30 years, there will be the equivalent of about 2,500 10 to 12 story apartment buildings built. It will have to happen inevitably, because if we are going to build the Australian economy, as we must do, to look after our ageing population and to do all the other things to make Australia a big and buoyant economy, we must do it on the back of population growth. If we're going to have continued and strong population growth in Melbourne and Sydney, they have to be housed. There are constraints on how that can be done, because not everybody can live in a single house on its own block of land. And when you cut all the influences that guide what future development will look like down to what it will have to be, that's where you end up. So the future landscape of Melbourne, which is comparatively flat at the moment, is going to look extraordinarily different in 30 years. In fact, Melbourne, most cities the size of Melbourne, which is about 5.5 million people, most cities around the world of Melbourne's size have between 30 and 40% of all of their housing stock in the form of apartments. And the average throughout the Western world is about 25% at least. Currently, Melbourne's apartments only contribute 7% of our housing stock. We are actually the most undersupplied city in the Western world of apartments and other forms of medium density housing. And we're just slow to come around to conforming in that way, because our population growth and the way we live is accelerating and catching up with what is pretty normal now, taken for granted around the rest of the world. I mean, that in itself causes a bit of an anxiety for some people just at the moment, because leaving aside impoverished countries, the main impact of COVID-19 was in those cities that have high density housing where people live in very close quarters. And the reason Australia, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, wasn't hit so hard with that was because we live in a relatively lower density environment altogether. So the question mark emerges, having learned from the pandemic, will we still graduate towards becoming higher rises and greater densities? And I think almost certainly yes, because the need to house doesn't have much choice, and dealing with the pandemic is probably something that we will be able to do via treatment or vaccine. So I would say that the destiny is pretty well set, and certainly in Melbourne and to some degree in Sydney as well, you're going to see a lot more apartments and other forms of affordable and convenient solution to housing, which actually gives the residential markets broadly a lot of underpin. For those that participate in the residential markets as developers or builders, it's a very deep vein of opportunity for decades to come. And for those of us that just buy it as our main asset, great. And for those of us that want to invest in it, there's still a lot of opportunity and a lot of underpin there. Yeah.
Does that go across the country? Because you've said a couple of things, underpins, there's strength for decades to come, Scott. So I mean, Australia is unique compared to the rest of the world, where we've got all these densities around the capital cities. We don't build cities in the desert like they do in America. So the fact that so many people are coming here, it sort of underpins that residential property in this country is a very good bet going forward. And do you subscribe to the next decade being greater than the one following, or do you see it being sort of consistent growth over the next 2 or 3 decades?
Well, I think it's got there's a strong depth of demand going forward. A couple of the things that most significantly affect that are this: people get very interested in what the real impact and necessity of population growth is. Well, let me just put this in order. In Australia, population growth is most reliant upon immigration. Immigration is about 60 to 65% of our population growth. Now, there is an economic and a social imperative that Australia get along with its Southeast Asian neighbours and beyond Southeast Asia, certainly China and India. And Australia being in that time zone and being a multicultural country with a lot of benefits is certainly going to remain forever a choice of a premium destination choice for immigrants wanting to leave those Asian countries and move somewhere else, Europe, America or Australia. Australia is going to be always preeminent. So we are going to be able to attract population growth based on immigration if we want it, and we certainly need it to grow the economy and to grow productivity. So no matter how much you shake it, Australia is going to continue to grow on population growth and immigration, and that will resume again after this pandemic interruption. It'll be back online within 18 months or 2 years. That growth is going to cause continued demand in the housing sector, because in this type of society, people don't live in shacks. They live under properly constructed roofs supported by properly constructed walls and properly poured concrete floors. And whether it's in traditional housing or whether it's in established standalone housing or whether it's apartments or whether it's townhouses, for every 2 people that come, we're going to need a new dwelling. And Australia, because its destiny too is to ultimately become part of the broader Asian region, it will continue to Asianise over the balance of this century. The population will probably double over the next 40 to 50 years. And that's an enormous demand for housing, not only in Melbourne and Sydney, which will get the major benefit of it, but across our other cities as well. I mean, Perth is closer to Asia and will get a benefit simply because of that. Brisbane will continue to get support because it's in a more friendly annual environment, weather-wise. Adelaide is pretty close to Melbourne in a sense, and even Tasmania has its attractions. So it's nobody's going to miss out. Nobody's going to miss out. Yeah.
Now, Scott, what I love about the knowledge of time that you have is that you've seen definitely trends in behaviour of our cities. So, by way of example, in the 70s, as you know, I was born in 71, but even in the early 80s, our cities were ghost towns. People came to work and effectively did their job, but by 5 p.m. they're off into their cars, onto our beautiful 4-lane, 5-lane freeways and out to their white picket fences in the suburbs. Yeah. Now, we saw obviously that change throughout the course of the 90s and the 2000s. Can you share with us those observations that you have seen over the decades and try and paint that picture for us around what has been that different behaviour that we've been seeing?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I mean, it was actually in the early 90s when we had that very severe recession that we had to have in Melbourne and Sydney that commercial property values actually crashed. A lot of people may not have been around then, but if you were, and you can remember, or if you look at the history books, in Melbourne, most commercial properties fell in value by 80%. It was absolutely catastrophic. Now, up until that time, commercial values had been such that residential development in the CBD wasn't viable. And you couldn't actually penetrate Melbourne's CBD for residential use because to the west you had the Docklands, to the south you had St Kilda and the industrial area there, To the north, you had the university precinct, and to the east, you had the heritage area of East Melbourne. So for one reason or another, there was this wall encircling the city of Melbourne, within which the commercial values were so high that residential development couldn't encroach, even if even if it wanted to. But as a result of the commercial crash, so many properties became so cheap that it did become viable for the first time to refurbish commercial properties into residential properties. And in Melbourne, it was the leading firm Central Equity 20 years ago that did that. And they really kickstarted this trend, and a lot of other developers realised it and got onto it. So, I mean, there was a specific event at a specific time. It was Central Equity in the early 90s that took advantage of the low commercial values, speculated a residential development, and kicked a whole renaissance off. And it's never really stopped to this day. And I think the current figures now, we've got 13 or 14,000 people living permanently in the CBD, something like that. That was a whole renaissance, and that's what started it. Now, going forward, one of the reasons that people have lived in the city is it's convenient, it's close to work, There is this school of thought now that what we've learned from the pandemic, that working remotely is more easy than people thought, and it can be very user-friendly, and it gives a work-life balance. There's no doubt that there will be some people that will say, I don't have to live in the city to work in the city anymore. So they might go and live in regional areas and work in the city and work remotely. So there'll be some people that will change their habits, and some work programs will change. But for a lot of people, living in the city still has its cultural and convenient benefits apart from being close to work. It will continue. It might just take a slightly different shape. I do think that one of the trends we're seeing is away from very small apartments to slightly bigger apartments in the city, and certainly around the city fringes. Only 3 and 4 kilometres from the city, and in Melbourne that means areas like South Yarra and Carlton and Richmond and so on. There's still quite a depth of demand for contemporary apartment developments in those sectors. Yeah.
Scott, sorry, Ben, we're still in the middle of recovering from a pandemic, particularly here in Melbourne. So the talk about people moving out to regional areas that were once sort of fringe commutable, do you think that steam or that momentum that exists now is just because we're still in it? And do you think that when we talk about 18 months, 2 years, when the coronavirus is behind us, do you think people will do a U-turn on that, or do you think it's just a good idea whilst we're in a bit of madness, or do you think it'll stick?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good question. At the moment, you would virtually describe it as being a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to something that's happened. Now, if that were going to be a new paradigm, you can understand that. But I actually think the interruption of this pandemic is going to pass pretty quickly. And I think that it will actually pass and confidence will return such that a lot of people might be thinking about moving out, but ultimately they won't need to, or they'll decide not to, because they will see the main driver, which was the threat of the pandemic itself, having subsided. Just to diverse for a moment, the federal government has what is emerging as a very specific 4-pronged strategy to get the economy going again. One is to invigorate and to clear the pathway as soon as possible, subject to pandemic treatment, for immigration to resume and foreign students to come back. The second one is accelerated infrastructure investment across the country. The third one is to have an open pathway and an unfettered opportunity for construction to continue. And the fourth one is to get the domestic borders down so that domestic tourism can get going again. Mm-hmm. If you combine that federal government 4-pronged strategy, secondly, with, so far as the pandemic is concerned, daily sort of more optic forecasts about a possible vaccine, and something that's not actually spoken about, but which is really improving, is the treatment standards for this. Since we started in March, the treatment standards for COVID-19 have improved dramatically, to the point that it's almost not that much worse than getting a cold for a lot of people. So if you look at the 4-pronged strategy of the government, if you look at the advances that are being made towards containing the health implications of the COVID-19, and then thirdly, if people remind themselves of the wonderful opportunity that sustained very low interest rates will bring into the equation, you'll see confidence turn around in this country much, much faster than I believe people are expecting. I imagine there'll be people making a decision in real estate 6 weeks from now that they wouldn't make at the moment, because the news is going to get that much better, that much faster. The only thing that would really throw a spanner in the works, and I don't see it happening, the only thing that would really throw a spanner in the works is if the second wave decrease in numbers of infection that we're now experiencing in Victoria was suddenly to sharply turn around the other way and go out of control again. And I don't think that's going to happen. And I mean, you know, just talking about interest rates particularly, the cost of borrowing and locking in long term now is so cheap that when you look to the opportunities in which you can reinvest, the arbitrage has never been as good. And it's going to be like that for some time. And a lot of people just won't be able to resist the opportunity if they understand what that opportunity is. I mean, there are plenty of people at the moment that have got unmortgaged assets. Say you've got a $2 million house with no mortgage, you can go and borrow $1 million on it at 3%, walk down the street and reinvest it at 6%. It's crazy. And because that is the case, that margin might reduce a little bit, but it's not going to go away entirely. And also, you know, in the housing market, I used the word earlier, underpin. Two of the major underpins are as this. For many people, what used to be a rental payment is now about the same as what a mortgage payment will be in this low interest rate environment. It always used to be that mortgage payments were so high, so you'd rent. That's the way a lot of people saw it. Well, now they're about the same within a certain value range and a certain LVR. So that of itself will allow a lot of people to go in and become home buyers. And the other thing is that there's been a huge amount of people who have just been out of the being able to buy because it was just a bit too expensive to get involved in real estate. That affordability has increased enormously. And if values did start to fall any further dramatically, combined with the low interest rates that are available, a lot of people that previously couldn't buy would rush in and underpin the market, given that opportunity. So there's almost like a sort of a safety net under the existing values. Yeah,
that's a significant point, I reckon, and something that, Ben, for our listeners to really let that land, that underpinning of people just on the affordability fringe, if any, it's almost like a stop loss on the share market, isn't it, Scott?
Yeah, exactly. It's a good way of describing it. Yeah.
Someone's ready to jump in.
Scott, I think you know, obviously with your large valuation firm, and you've got, you know, valuers out there every day valuing the residential space. How are they seeing the market? Are they seeing a bit more cautious, or have they even been surprised in terms of how resilient the residential market has been? Because we saw the mainstream media go pretty heavy at the worst case scenarios and leading their stories with 30 and 40% corrections. What are you seeing? You know, this is what I love about talking to you. You're a valuation firm, right? You're on the ground every day doing the work. Where is your team at in terms of their expectations of these declines?
Well, you used the word resilient, and we're going to use that word at some point pretty quickly in this conversation because it's important. Let me just flash through what's happening in the residential markets for your listeners. The first thing is, let's just put the real estate markets in context. There are inner urban localities, middle urban localities, and fringe localities. And just by locality, those three localities all behave differently. And then you've got established housing broadly, you've got townhouses, and then you've got apartments. And those three categories of built form behave differently. So when you mix in three basic forms of housing and three basic localities, you've got a broad range of markets, and none of them behave the same. And if you take the two extremes, take a $10 million established beautiful home in inner Melbourne or inner Sydney or inner Perth or inner Adelaide, it's going to behave far differently because it's a far different market to a new house and land package on the fringe of any of those cities, okay? And also, the further in you come, the stronger, it's a fact, the stronger the socioeconomic profile of your owners. So typically your homeowner of a $10 million home is going to be financially a lot richer than your typical owner of a new house and land package. So you throw all this into the mix. How can you possibly begin to believe what so many media commentators are saying, that the market's fallen by, whether they say 10%, 15% or 20%, how can a single figure represent the market? That's rubbish. So if you break it up, generally in Melbourne, in Australia's cities, the inner urban markets, the higher value houses and apartments are totally resilient to and almost completely unaffected by the interruption of COVID-19. Certainly there have been fewer sales. The turnover's been less because participants have been more cautious and people have stalled decisions and one thing and another, but the values have not been impacted measurably at all. And the further you go out from the inner suburbs to the outer suburbs, you do start to see some vulnerability creeping in, but not significant. And also, you've got to understand this, that when you talk about population growth and the component of population growth that I was referring to earlier, its major component, which is immigration, immigration has nothing to do with the demand for or the value of inner urban property. Immigrants coming into Australia don't affect the value of houses in Toorak, and they don't affect the value of houses in, Potts Point or Double Bay in Sydney, not to any extent, other than for the very odd rich one, All of these factors need to be considered, and if you strip them back to the real impact that they're likely to have, our house view at Charter is that the inner suburbs are pretty well resilient, that established housing in all its forms is pretty resilient, that the medium suburbs, the medium locality suburbs, 20 and 15 kilometres from the CBD, may fall by 5%, not significant. And to the extent that the falls will be greatest, they will probably be where the people can least afford it, and that is on the urban fringe, or it might be in cheaper, more generic investment apartments. But even these potentially vulnerable markets all again have their own sort of underpinning. For example, the outer suburbs are being underpinned by first home buyer and first home grants and builder grants and so on. A lot of people that think that generic, fairly ordinary apartments are going to suffer because of lower rents, because of Airbnb coming away from its short-term market and participating in the long-term market. What they don't realise is that within a year or two, as soon as tourism, particularly domestic tourism, eventually followed by international tourism, picks up again, Airbnb will go back to where it belongs and it won't interfere with the traditional apartment market. And also at the moment, just before COVID came along, in both Melbourne and in Sydney, there had been economic factors slowing the pipeline of new apartments. So the pipeline was slowing down a bit. What's happened now is that we're experiencing lower demand just temporarily, and the production has really stopped just at the moment. And so the demand that is there, even though it is lower, is being supplied by what was the existing dwindling supply of already established apartments. So we're at a low point in demand and we are at a low point of supply, but there's a bit of balance there. What's going to happen is that as COVID gets under control and people are less worried about it, and as immigration picks up and students come back and so on, demand is going to pick up far more quickly than will the apartment supply line re-gear up to start producing apartments. In fact, the production pipeline will be about 2 years behind the demand. And so within 18 months to 2 years from now, we will be going back into critical undersupply.
Mm-hmm.
So
because
Scott,
demand will pick up before supply can crank back into gear.
So
there are a whole lot of reasons out there why people who own apartments who are worried about it at the moment should be less anxious. You've got to remember that within property, you're strategically in a long-term game and a long-term hold, a long-term investment strategy. No matter how long it takes, dealing with COVID-19 is going to be a relatively short-term interruption, and we will return to normality because the destiny of Australia and what it requires in terms of housing only has one form, and that is what we've been used to. We'll come back and we'll see it in the future. Yeah.
So you're not seeing any systemic risk in the medium to longer term from medium and high density at the moment, which is good news, because obviously that's where most of the risk was probably lying. And you're sort of saying sort of the inner area and middle ring areas really are holding up very resiliently, and values are very stable because the supply side has come down and demand is still meeting supply at the moment.
That's right. Look, let's balance this with a couple of objective observations. At this very moment, this Friday in Melbourne, you will find developers who are saying, "Oh, look, I'm really finding it difficult to move my stock," and you'll find some other developers will say, "I'm really finding it difficult to get the sort of debt that I need from the banks at the moment to kick off my new development." And you'll find a landlord who says, "My apartment became vacant 2 months ago and I was getting 450 a week and the vacancy rate's gone up and I can only get 400 a week for at the moment, or I can only get 375 a week at the moment." Yes, at the moment, you will find quite a few examples of people's expectations and traditional performance not being met. What I'm saying is that is all going to be relatively short term, and it will repair itself, because all of the influences that got those markets to where they were are just sitting in the wings waiting to resume their impact again.
Fantastic. Lovely summary. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Scott, I'd be interested to know, particularly given the breadth of experience you've had in the Melbourne marketplace, what's your view on Geelong? It's clearly regional, but over the last decade, it could almost be forgiven for being an outer suburb of Melbourne, particularly with a lot of people moving down there to chase a bit of lifestyle. What's your view on Geelong?
Well, when you say it's behaving like a suburb, you're taking the words out of my mouth. I'm on the record over the last 5 or 6 years of having done my best to encourage certain investors to look very seriously at regional Victoria. The people that I've advised to consider that have been young kids. You see some young kid leaning on the bonnet of his Alfa Romeo wearing a $2,000 Armani suit, and he says, "God, housing's expensive. I can't get in there." I say, well, look, you've got a couple of things to take into account, mate. But if you can't afford to buy in Melbourne, go and buy in the regional areas. That's what I said to a lot of young people, even if it were only as an investment. And I've also said to commercial developers and investors that the relative cheapness and therefore attraction of regional residential housing will mean that residential activity will lead growth in those centres. And so you should get in early and start to buy some commercial sites to build shopping centres and the other sort of non-residential development that any growing residential community needs. So I've been a big advocate of regional Victoria for some time. And the main reason that I have been is because in the context of Australia, Victoria is a relatively small state with a very big city, unlike any other states. New South Wales, Sydney is a big city, but New South Wales is a very big state. And all the other capital cities are relatively small. So you don't get this contrast between small state and big city elsewhere in Australia. It's peculiar to Victoria. And for that reason, a lot of our regional areas, such as Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo, any of them in Victoria, do tend to behave more like suburbs than just isolated regional cities. And the road and rail transport links are pretty good. So even before COVID-19 was conceived, I was saying to people that you should keep a very interested investment eye on the opportunity that these regional centres offer. Now, Geelong's the biggest regional centre of all. It's only an hour from Melbourne. It was always a cost alternative. It has a great social and community lifestyle. And so no wonder values have increased. And it will continue to happen. And you will see the same happening in these other areas. I described the northwest of Melbourne going out to Castlemaine and between Ballarat and Bendigo as being the equivalent of the Victorian Cotswolds, that really delightful part of the English countryside. You've got rolling hills, historic buildings, wonderful architecture, comparatively very low prices. And now it's all been given a supercharge with COVID-19 because everybody wants to go and live there and work remotely, So Whether
Was it-
that'll be a lasting turbocharge, I don't know.
Yeah.
But certainly there's a continuing depth of opportunity in regional Victoria for people that can adapt to that environment. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I made the move down to the surf coast. I live in Torquay, so there was a little self-interest in that. But I can tell you from talking to the local agents down here, they're all run off their feet with people, particularly in Melbourne, sight unseen, wanting to buy some houses.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, can you help us understand through the mind of a valuer, when they do go to value an off-the-plan asset, what's some of the things that they need to think about? Because again, in some of the articles and the blogs that you've written, you know, there's stamp duty concessions, there's rental guarantees, there's furniture packages, there's a bunch of things that come with it. So
Right.
what's the approach that you take when you're valuing?
Let's dispel a bit of a myth. And for those of you who are listening, my figures are going to come pretty quick and fast. So I'll give you 30 seconds to scratch around and get a piece of paper and a pencil, and then
They can replay it. They can replay it.
And just in a minute, write these figures down. So let's say we're going back 2 years ago, and somebody's buying an apartment off the plan for $500,000. Okay, and the agent or the developer says, "Look, this is such a good deal because you buy for $500,000 now. In 2 years' time, when you actually settle on this, it'll probably be worth, at least $550,000, and you'll be able to borrow 85% of $550,000. In fact, I've got a calculator here in front of me at the moment. So let's say he says you'll be able to borrow 85% of $550,000. So you'll be able to borrow $467,500. You'll almost be able to fund your purchase with no equity. So everybody dives in and believes that's a great idea. So let's just assume, as in fact has happened, that the market didn't go up by that 10% anyway. Let's just assume that the market's been reasonably stable. So you bought it for $500,000, and the value is coming along 2 years later when you settled for the bank and valuing it. What is the valuer valuing? What he's now valuing is a completed apartment that does not have stamp duty savings. And when you bought your apartment off the plan for $500,000 and you got your stamp duty savings, would you have paid the same price if you weren't getting stamp duty savings? The answer is no. The answer is no. So a property that was bought for $500,000 off the plan will probably value, everything else being equal, value at a margin less than the equivalent of the stamp duty anyway. And then other things that influenced prices that valuers don't take into account were incentives, white good fit outs, all of these other sorts of things that were part of the sales promotion at the time. So instead of the property valuing at $550 2 years later, it's probably right that it values at about $450 in most cases. And that's not the value of being conservative. That's just adjusting for the market and the facts. And unfortunately, in the interim, the banks have gone from lending 85% to 75%. So you're now getting 75% of 450, which is a lot less than the 85% of the 550 that you were contemplating. So a lot of people were caught out by that. And whilst you think this might have led to a lot of settlements not proceeding, it in fact didn't, because a lot of people were able to make up the money one way or the other. But the important thing to remember out of this, if nothing else, was that in the day of stamp duty savings being very significant, which is now past, certainly in Victoria, that was the reason why valuations generally didn't match up to what you had paid. And it wasn't the value of being conservative. But also, we're slightly seeing a change in things. 18 months ago in Melbourne, of apartments being purchased off the plan, they were 60% investors and 40% intending owner-occupiers. In 18 months, that's swung around enormously. And for apartments being sold in Melbourne off the plan at the moment, 70% are owner-occupiers and 30% are investors. So what's happened in a relatively short period of 18 months is that investors have really contracted and owner-occupiers have surged in prominence. Now, it's not because of the motivations of those two groups entirely. It's also because developers have stopped producing a lot of generic investment quality stock and are largely only producing smaller scale, better spec projects aimed at owner-occupiers. So it's actually a combination of purchaser sentiment and stock availability.
Mm.
And what we're seeing is a return to the sort of markets which are more common overseas, which is that pre-sales are not such the major factor that they were here. And this, of course, has ramifications for developers because the banking fraternity needs to adjust its thinking that it can only lend construction finance subject to a certain level of pre-sales. So what the finance industry is doing now is adjusting its thinking and not requiring as many pre-sales, but in return it's requiring the developers to put in more equity, which means they can't leverage debt as much as they used to, which means the internal rates of or real commercial returns on their investments aren't as high as they used to be. So developers are saying, well, look, the landscape's changed. I can't get the pre-sales I used to. I can't get the debt that I used to. So I don't want to get myself emerged and stuck in a really big development. I'd rather do 3 smaller developments than one big one. So I've got greater agility and I can respond to a changing market that's still finding a new settlement point, you see. So these are some...
Sorry to interrupt. I feel really fortunate. I feel like I'm at the front row of an amazing masterclass of property. But what about old school flats, right? So apartments, the newer style, but you've got right through decos, right through to 60s and 70s, the old 3-level walk-ups that are in really good positions. What do you think the future of those types of things? I know in Melbourne, more in the north, they're a little bit more scarce than in the south, where Elwood and St Kilda and all those places have got a lot of them. But do you have a separation of view around the newer style apartments versus the old school flats?
Well, look, I do to some extent. I think that some of those, the older ones, the Art Deco, the solidly constructed, the 30s, the 40s, and so on, generally they're more spacious, they're more solid, they're always in better locations, generally speaking, because they were inner urban. And I think for a lot of people, that's a great way to go, because I can tell you, you put a new kitchen and a new bathroom in those, and not only will they add value, you'll make a margin in most instances, and there's a lot of developers that take on 2 or 3 of those sorts of apartments or a block of them and do exactly that. And most of them can't get a block of them because they've all over time gone individual ownership, so they pick them off one at a time wherever they can find them. They're very popular with speculators to do that, and the end product's very popular with first home buyers. I think some of the my personal preference. I'd rather buy a house, but if I were buying an apartment, I'd probably prefer to buy older, more solidly built, lower rise, smaller community than higher rise, more recently built, more flimsy, large community. Because one of the distinctions I make there is that I think that the standard of body corporate management in Australia is still pretty awful, and I wouldn't like to be an owner participating in a
special
environment,
levy.
in 200 or 300 apartments. Given the standard of body corporate management that's around, I'd much rather be defending for myself amongst several other owners or a handful of owners. So my preference, given my years of experience, would be to buy older in the smaller developments closer into town, renovate, and be part of a smaller community of people, all of whom you know, than some lost number in a huge body corporate. Yeah.
So Scott, that's the $64 million question that I think I get asked the most. If someone says, I've got a budget, what do I buy and where do I buy? With land being king, and you've talked about what you've seen over your 5 decades, where we used to buy freestanding houses, then they went to sort of semis, and then we've got obviously townhouses, and then we've got small block apartments, and we've got medium and high density. So if I was to say to you, Scott, what should I do with my money? What's your view about location of that land versus the type of dwelling that you get?
Well, if we go back to...
For investment purposes, I should probably context you.
Well, look, whether it's investment purposes or whether it's owner occupation, what we're interested in is capital gain, and capital gain will work regardless of what our motive is.
Yes.
So if you look at the 3 categories, Value relates basically to land. So if you can afford it, the best category of asset is to buy a house on its own land, followed by a townhouse, or lastly an apartment. And the affordability ranks accordingly as well. And so, first home buyers without a lot of money buy an apartment, then they gravitate to a townhouse, then ultimately they gravitate to a house. And I'd much rather have one house than 3 apartments, or 2 townhouses than 5 apartments, or whatever the case may be. Of those 3 categories, oddly, the category that's really performed better than most people would have expected has been townhouses. Townhouses are a lifestyle. They're a cost alternative to an established house. An apartment is a cost alternative to a townhouse. So a townhouse is in the middle, as we all understand. Apartments, townhouses, established homes. Townhouses in the middle suburbs have been very, very good performers. And I think they'll continue to be. Although there again, I'd be looking for townhouses, that are one of a relatively few, 4, 6, 8, probably no more than that. More separation than adjoining walls, good car parking, probably solid brick and then brick veneer, or brick veneer all over rather than lightweight construction up on the top. And probably the best floor plan is 2 bedrooms plus a study, with a study that could improvise as a 3rd bedroom, or 3 bedrooms. 2 bedrooms only and a townhouse isn't really the best mix. Most townhouse buyers who have wanted something in preference to an apartment are looking for 2 bedrooms plus. So if you're looking for, for those that can't afford to buy an established house in the area that they should look at, that they would prefer, they should look on the fringe of that suburb that they like, or the next adjoining cheaper suburb, and go for a 2 bedroom plus townhouse as a general rule. Yeah.
That's wonderful advice.
Terrific. Hey, Scott, I could chat all day. I appreciate you're a very busy man and you have lots to do. So my final question for you is, what's the most interesting property that you've had to value over your 50 years?
Well, we actually even value international shipping lanes, which people wouldn't have thought. I mean, the international shipping lanes are owned, and they're to navigate your ship along a certain navigation line, you have to pay charges and so on forth. But in terms of conventional,
imagine navigating the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal, and that'll be a challenge.
Look, firstly, in the residential, let's keep it there. In the residential category, some of the largest traditional historic mansion homes. I valued a property in Melbourne. I'm not going to give the address of it, but I valued a residential property in Melbourne the other day for $80 million. So, they do exist. And some of these really large homes that actually have taste and architectural finesse, interesting history, beautiful grounds. Examples of those in Melbourne, for example, would be Raheen, where the Pratt family lives in Kew, Cranlana, where the Meyer family lives in Toorak, and some of the very other large estates. They're a real pleasure to inspect, and some of the seaside properties as well, with their beautiful surrounding and circumstances. I've got to say, most flats and townhouses are pretty much the same. You get real variety, interest and pleasure valuing some of the more exotic large family estates.
That's brilliant, Scott. And it probably comes to my last question, which is, when you do get to that sort of level, it can't just all be in the land value, right? There's obviously a scarcity and a rarity that you're putting a valuation on. And we talk about that in terms of character and charm and historical properties over contemporary properties. Do you see in those eastern suburbs, in those areas where you've got a lot of character and charm, that there is a buyer's interest that pushes the value of those a little bit higher than some of the contemporary stuff, as opposed to just the land value underneath it?
Yes, certainly. And it's always in the particular in each case by itself. But certainly, look, there's an appreciation, for architecture, absolutely. I've just got to say, for the benefit of your listeners too, that, we've been predominantly talking about residential valuations. Of all the things that my firm does, like, project management, surveying, construction, building, we work in the capital markets and everything that we do. Valuations is about 40% of what we do, and residential valuations is about 20% of our valuations. So it's a fairly small segment. We've got over 100 values, and we spread ourselves. I'm very approachable. I'm always interested in helping people, and particularly helping people avoid traps. If any of your listeners at any stage, want to ring me and find their way to me through you, they're most welcome to do so. I'm always happy to have a chat on the phone. I'm not an opportunist. I mean that genuinely. I don't charge people to have a conversation. So if people have a particular issue or a problem, or they want some independence, or maybe some of the things we've discussed today they're curious to pursue, they're most welcome through you to contact me. I have no problem with that at all.
And we love your blogs, and we read them religiously. You're obviously, a mentor to the likes of people like Bryce and I. As I said, I've been privileged to spend some counsel and some time with you over my journey, and I can't thank you enough for that, because it certainly helped form my thinking around the gentrification and the changes that have occurred in the 25 years that I've been doing this, and that's put me in good stead in terms of capital growth focuses and land to asset ratios and all of those wonderful things that you've shared with me, Scott. So I wanted to personally thank you for that.
That's
and
very
also
kind.
thank you for coming on to our show. And I think this is obviously going to be a show that's going to be well liked. You could get 70,000 people ringing you, Scott. That's a problem. Certainly, one of the things we want to do is, there is your weekly and monthly content that you put out through Keck, Cramer, and so that could be something we'll certainly put in the show notes if people want to.
Well, you're most welcome to do that. I mean, you get most of the stuff that we send out, and you don't need my permission to send it on and forward it to your friends and customers. That's no problem.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Well, incredibly generous. I think most people will be falling off their chair at the thought that they could spend some time talking to you on the phone. I'll back up what Ben said. I'm incredibly grateful for you coming onto our show and sharing your wisdom. And what a shame that lives are busy, because we could talk all day. But on behalf of us on the Property Couch, and for all of our listeners who got to listen to that masterclass, thanks for coming on to the Property Couch, Scott.
Let's just make a bet so that I can say I told you so. Why don't we do this again in three or 4 months' time and see how things have moved?
Oh, I'd love to.
Lock
it in. We'll get you back in early in the autumn selling season in February and March, and we'll have that conversation, Scott. Absolutely.
Okay, I look forward to that. Okay.
Terrific. Wonderful.
Thanks very much,
Scott.
Okay.
I appreciate it. All right, Ben. I mean, that was one of those moments, I've got to say, where I was very conscious, because at the beginning of the interview, Scott said to us, "How long are we gonna have?" And I reluctantly went, "Oh, could be." I said, I wimped out. I went, 30 minutes, hoping that he would forgive us for going a little bit longer. And you've gone straight for that. No, it's more like 45 minutes, Scott. And then he started panicking, going, "Well, we'll just see how we go." So I was conscious of the fact he's a very busy man, and we could have just kept asking question after question after question. But I think we got some gold dished up there.
Yeah, I could spend a year with Scott and learn every day. So it's a real privilege for our community to be able to have, someone with such knowledge and understanding of the market and long-term understanding of the market, and been through significant upheaval in the market. Like, when he was talking about what happened with the collapse of Pyramid and the diabolical economic situation Melbourne was in during certain periods, obviously the Joan Kerner period, where manufacturing was really struggling here in Victoria. So he's been through, oil crises, the floating of the dollar, GST launching, the recession that we had to have, the GFC, and now obviously a pandemic. So the guy can convey real life examples that is just amazing. So, we do thank Scott, and what an absolute joy that he's committed to coming back on to continue the conversation with us. So we'll continue to.
I wonder if you'll get nervous about 3:30 this RV, Ben, when his phone starts running hot, though.
Yeah, that's right. Please respect. He is a very busy man. He's very generous by saying that, but please, obviously, if please don't expect that as an open invitation to go.
Well, what I could say to that, Ben, is he was generous, but if people have follow-up questions, he's promised that he'll come back on and give us a follow-up. So send us some questions, and we'll we'll gladly ask them so that all the community can benefit. But Ben, I think we've talked about this, and our fingerprints on this conversation are all over the 302 episodes that we've done. But largely, we have this enormous confidence in Australia as a destination because of the fact that our superpower is this population growth, albeit on pause, but this population growth that we will continue to attract. So it was just like an amplifying message towards the back end of that interview where Scott was infinitely positive, even to the point where around, we're still of the view that you should avoid medium and high density apartments, but his view is that the skyline is going to be littered with those going forward, just to cater for the demand that's coming. So even for those people that are stuck in poor performing assets, if you're prepared to play the long game and hold them long enough, he's of the view that you'll be fine.
Yeah. I mean, land is king, but he also, valuing an $80 million residential property in Toorak, confirming that our long-held belief, and I've been privileged enough to know this position for a long time from Scott, but that, we talk about owner-occupier appeal and character and charm and scarcity of the actual physical asset, even though technically, if it's mass produced, it deteriorates in value. But if it stays around long enough, and you've got Edwardian, Victorian, Art Decos, clinkers, all of these different styles of properties that now have intrinsic value in them, and so it's not just in the land. So that is going to continue to play out. The validation around house first, freestanding, then semi, then townhouse, then apartment, also validates all the stuff we've been saying. So it's great to be able to lean into the gurus of the industry. And we, again, thank Scott very much for his time.
And it's official, Ben. Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo are no longer regional Victoria. They are just outer suburbs of Melbourne. You heard it here first from Scott Keck on the podcast. So interesting stuff, isn't it? The way that things evolve. And interesting too, his observations around small state, big population, and the observations around why those three regional towns, he sort of sees them as out of metropolitan Melbourne. So thank you, Scott. We appreciated every single minute of that. I certainly hope that everyone who's listened to that interview has got a lot out of it, Ben. So really, really good stuff. Hey, my life hack today is really circling back to my mindset minute, Ben, which is I've done this before because I've read this book many, many years ago. Reading it again has reminded me of the importance of it, and I'm going to continue to do it. But when you are, particularly in times like this, Ben, when people need a lift, if you're picking up your takeaway, if you're down at the shopping centre, if you're getting some groceries and someone's got a name badge on, say their name, Ben. It's pretty simple, and watch the difference that it makes in the eyes and the expression of the person who hears their name. You say thanks Ben, thanks Ivis, thanks Emma, whatever it is, and versus just all these transactions that are happening. So my life hack today is I encourage everyone to go out and do that when they're interacting with some people. Mention them by name. It's pretty easy if they've got a name badge on, but the important bit is just watch the change of the expression on their face, because it's not only life-giving to them, but it's actually life-giving to you as the person who is part of that exchange. So there you go. Check that out. Ben, what's making property news?
Oh, Bryce, I'll tell you what, I've got a full book today. I'm conscious of time though. So I think there's a couple of really important bits of information that have been released over the last week and a half. And so I've had a bit of time to look at some of this. The one I want to lead with is a fantastic research report that was released by the Reserve Bank of Australia, led by Jonathan Kearns, Mike Mayer and David Norman. And it's a research paper that they did on how risky is Australian household debt. Because in these times, we're seeing these naysayers and doomsdayers continually to get a lot of airtime through the mainstream media. Say a Martin North as an example, where, predicting sort of 30-40% property price collapses and so forth on the back of affordability and household debt. So these guys at the RBA, economists and research analysts, put this extensive paper together, and I think it's a really interesting read where they focused on answering three questions about how much risk this debt poses to Australia by, what accounts, for the rise in household debt to income ratio and its level in the Australian relative to other countries. So they looked at it in relativity. They also looked at it in terms of what losses might the Australian banking system suffer from these exposures in the event of a severe stress. And we have seen people, talking about they want to only work with ADIs, authorised deposit taking institutions, because they can guarantee $250,000 per person. Well, there's very little risk there, and we've been saying that for a long time. I wouldn't be making judgment calls on the fact that you think your money might go somewhere else. And finally, how does household debt affect the sensitivity of consumption in Australia to severe economic shock? And that is really a question about the wealth effect that we've always been talking about. So I'll just quickly summarise that the results suggest that the risk arising from household indebtedness are more subtle than sometimes conveyed. And I think that's a really important message, in particular fundamental factors, i.e. higher real incomes, a fall in nominal interest rates, financial liberalisation and household ownerships of the rental stock do give us this underbedding and resilience to a severe downturn, thanks to the moderate loan to value ratios and residential mortgages and distribution of debt in terms of around that sort of areas. So it's a really good paper. I will put a link in the show notes. We'll get Ivis to help us do that, to have a read. It's obviously a technical paper, but it just really does highlight that. So that's definitely one that should give those people who might be a bit concerned around, the naysayers and the people arguing the risk in property prices medium to longer term. It just doesn't appear to be in the thinking of, our thought leaders in this space, and I concur with that position. So it doesn't say that there are no risks, because there are always risks. There are always risks in everything, but that is a fascinating paper. So I encourage everyone to have a look at that. In summarising the August results out from CoreLogic, I'll summarise it this way. Bryce, 5 of the 8 capital cities are either steady or growing in property prices. Wow. And only 3 are contracting. And we know the biggest one, which is Melbourne at 1.2%. And I'm tipping that Brisbane won't be contracting in a matter of months. So that then just leaves Sydney and Melbourne, and I'm still reasonably bullish about their prospects, but it'll probably be later this year or early into the new year we'll start to see some positive numbers come out there. So I'm bucking a bit of the trend that you're seeing from some economists in terms of what they think the house price will do, but time will tell. But I'm certainly bullish about those marketplaces that are open, and I'm based that obviously on a baseline theory that we'll see minimal further sort of escape of the virus, and we'll have that suppression strategy continuing to work, where we just bubble along across the bottom with minimum infection. So with that as a backdrop, I'm a little bit more bullish about that pent-up demand, and obviously a very limited number of properties available for sale. So we'll see what happens there on the back of historically low interest rates.
Ben, there's no doubt. Sorry, just to jump in there. There is no doubt. I make no mistake. Like, we're exposed across multiple states within, the buyers team that I'm overseeing. There is pent up demand. I can promise every single listener that we largely, as an investment representative, investment buyer representative, the team knows that there are owner occupiers in their droves lining up. So it will be a very busy spring. So the doomsday is like, someone rang me the other day and said, "Oh, Bryce, how are you going? Is everything all right? With all the negativity around property." I'm like, negativity? Like, Scott Keck said it beautifully, Ben, in the interview, where he says there's three rings: the inner, the middle, and the outer fringe. And then within each of those rings, there's the apartment, the townhouse, the housing market. So there's 3 times, at minimum, there's 9 segments of the market. So yeah. Which segment are you talking about?
Yeah, no, that's well summarised, mate. Well said. So I think from that point of view, we'll just have to wait and see. But we're also, the Select Residential Property guys, our head of research there, Jeremy Shepherd, we're working on a report that really just highlights the markets within markets. So stand by for that, hopefully in the next month, we will have a brand new report that we'll be releasing in line with our new website that we're building there. So that'll be fun. And finally, Bryce, I'll just cap it off. We got our GDP numbers yesterday. 28 years gone. 28 years,
Yes,
just over 28
the run
years
is over.
Positive economic growth. I mean, good run. Well done, Australia. But it's come to an end. Negative 0.3 in the March quarter, and then obviously the worst quarter on history by a country mile of a -7 that we saw in the June quarter, led by obviously household expenditure, which makes up 60% of our GDP in terms of our consumption. So that was down -12.1. Some fascinating numbers in that, Bryce, something that you'll never see again. Transport services and services down 85.9%. Accommodation and food services down 39%, and arts and retail down 22.6%. You just don't see those numbers in a mature market. You normally see movements of less than a half of 1%. So those numbers are just, eye-popping.
Eye-watering.
Yeah, they're just eye-watering. I mean, in terms of what you get. So, that's what it is. But I tend to think that we are at the other side. Victoria is doing quite well now in terms of, you've always got to remember that infections take between 9 and 14 days to show up in people. So, the numbers that we're getting today are from 2 weeks ago. I think we've got to be reminded of that. So we're getting those numbers down, which does mean that through contraction and isolation and lockdowns, you can get on top of the virus if you want to. And that's a good test. And that should give people a little bit more confidence to know that there is a means by getting on top of any sort of second wave. And I think people are getting more comfortable with the new norm that is this pandemic, and I suspect we'll try and get on with our lives as best we can. And that will include, look at the balance sheet, I think was up 19%. The household savings are up 19%. You just don't get those types of numbers, right? So there's plenty of money in a household bank accounts, which we've been consistently saying, and that also gives us some strong support around the issues around any systemic risk in defaults on mortgages. I don't think that's there. I mean, the demand side, I think, will absorb that pretty well. So, yeah, interesting numbers. So a lot happening, Bryce, in the property and finance space. I just thought we needed to highlight those because it's been a busy 10 days in that space.
It has been. What a big episode, Ben. There's a bit. I think there's a bit in there for everyone. If there isn't, let us know. We'll make sure we include you. But again, a very special thanks to Scott for joining us today. It was an excellent chat, and we look forward to backing that up, Ben. Just a little reminder for the folks who've made it all the way to the end, Ben. Audio book next week. Those the people whose jam is listening, which you'd expect a podcast audience to be, Ben. Those people who like to listen rather than read. Stick around next week. We'll give you some details on how you can get access to our audio book, and maybe let me know what 4 days in the studio ended up with, Ben.
Very good.
Until next week, Ben.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it.
There you go, folks. See you next week.
Hey there, folks. Bryce Holdaway here. Before you go, if you're new to our community and only listen to maybe a handful of episodes, I thoroughly recommend that you go all the way back to episode number 1, where we unpack all of the foundations when it comes to property investing. Now, for those of you that might be a little bit time poor, I've got good news for you. We have a binge guide that you can download straight away, which summarizes the first 20 episodes where Ben and I unpack the foundational pillars of the A, B, C, D, and so much more. And you can get that straight away. If you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20, you can download it and consume it whenever you want. It's completely free and available now. And for those of you, just a quick reminder that nothing we've spoken about today constitutes financial advice. We recommend that you reach out to your licensed professional advisor so that you can look at your unique circumstances before acting on any information. Now don't forget, go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20 and get your binge guide today.